So I'm introduce Jan, a postdoctoral researcher at the Center for Music in the Brain at Aarhus University and also at the Institute of Psychology at the University of Graz in Austria. And as Mel mentioned, was previously at the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig, and we all overlap there. So I'm very excited to hear what he's been up to more recently. And the title of his talk is The Effects of Musical Taste, Cultural Familiarity, and Empathy on Social Bonding when Moving to Music. Take it away, Jan.
Thanks, Peter, and thanks for the invitation. It's super nice to see all the familiar faces here. I guess the good part about having an online conference is nobody can complain about the food. So that's maybe it's a good thing, maybe it's a bad thing. But yeah, I hope you're all back from a nice lunch. As Peter already said, I'm going to talk about the effect of musical taste, cultural familiarity, and empathy on social bonding when moving to music. But before we start, I want to start by introducing one of the, I think, most influential studies. We were talking about Mike Hove earlier. This is work that he did with Jane Risen, and it's one of the very influential papers on social bonding and moving in synchrony. They had participants move together with an experimenter, and they were either moving in synchrony or in asynchrony to a visual moving stimulus. And what they could show is that participants in the synchrony condition liked the experimenter significantly more than those in the asynchrony condition. They also had this kind of control condition where the participant was tapping alone and the experimenter was just sitting there in the room. Just to make sure that it's really about the movement and not about another person being there. And one of the questions that we had was, what happens if we add music to the interpersonal movement synchronization? And this is, of course, not just a question that we had. A lot of work has been done on this. For example, I could mention Alexander Demos' great study with the rocking chairs, or also Wiltemuth and Heath, also 2009 experiment where they had this kind of rhythmic cups game where people were singing together, moving cups together, so they were also moving in synchrony with music. And then there's, of course, I know I'm not mentioning all of the studies that have been done, but there's Laura Cirelli's work, mostly with children, which is also super interesting. But I want to focus on 3 studies that I did during the recent years. In the first study, we were asking, how does music affect social bonding in interpersonal movement interactions? In the second study that I want to present later, we asked, how do cultural background and personal musical taste affect social bonding in interpersonal movement interaction? And in the last one, we were asking, how does trait empathy affect social bonding in interpersonal movement interactions? But before we go into detail, I want to take you on a quick detour. That is one from between subject designs to within subject designs. Because a typical design in social interactions actually involves an experimenter and a participant. And that was also the first thing that I did during my PhD a few years ago. So one of the first studies that we did was we had a participant and an experimenter. They were tapping on the same drum pad, and they were either tapping in synchrony or in asynchrony with music or metronome. So we had this nice 2x2 design, synchronous tapping or asynchronous tapping, and music or a metronome. And what we found was when we asked participants how friendly was the experimenter you were interacting with, there was absolutely no difference between the different conditions. So there was no main effect of synchrony, there was no main effect of music versus the metronome. But the reason for this, at least in this experiment that I'm showing you right now, is because we had this ceiling effect, which probably was driven by social desirability. We don't know, but this might be one of the reasons. So you see that the ratings are almost all at like between 8.7 and 9. And our scale was a Likert scale from 1 to 9. So yeah, we had this huge ceiling effect. Interestingly, we also had an implicit measure where we asked, or where participants, of course, they didn't know about it, but they were just waiting for the experimenter to get some papers that they had to fill out. And on the way, the experimenter knocked off a cup where there were a few pencils in there. I think it was 8 pencils. And as a measure of social behavior, we counted the number of pencils that the participants picked up, because the experimenter had these books or papers in their hand and they couldn't pick them up, so we gave the participant a bit of time. So this is kind of an implicit measure of social behavior, pro-social behavior. And then we actually found that when the participants were tapping with the experimenter and when they were listening to music, they helped an experimenter that was tapping in synchrony more than an experimenter that was tapping asynchronously. And for the metronome, there was no effect of synchrony at all. Of course, we only had 40 participants in total, and this implicit measure can give you kind of an idea of pro-social behavior, but I think we shouldn't overinterpret that. So we were looking for a way to implicitly, to measure social bonding in a within subject design, to have a bit more of power actually, and to also avoid social desirability in this kind of social setting. So what you just saw was videos of 2 moving stick figures, and we asked the participants to imagine that they are one of these stick figures and that the other stick figure represents an unknown person. And they could either walk in synchrony, as you saw right now on the left side, in asynchrony, as you saw on the left side, or in synchrony, as you now see on the right side. And then, of course, we could pair this with music, with a metronome, or we could just have it silently playing, and we could ask participants how strong they feel connected to the virtual other, or how well they feel as their own figure, or stuff like that. So this is also what we used in the first experiment. We had 3 different synchrony conditions. Either both figures were walking in phase with each other in the stimulus, or the own figure was moving in phase and the other out of phase. Or then in the third condition, the own figure was moving out of phase and the other figure in phase. And we paired that with either just silence or a metronome that was in time with a step frequency, or with music, and we chose kind of a groovy piece. We chose Thinking by the Meters, which is very rhythmic, has a clear beat, and it's really groovy, so induces movement. And I will jump to the results. As you can see, there was not a big difference in the likability of the other figure when comparing silence and metronome. So adding a metronome didn't really increase the likability of the other figure, no matter in which synchrony condition. But adding music significantly increased the likability of the other figure. What we also saw is that with music, the difference between I am in synchrony and the other person is out, and I am out of synchrony and the other person is in synchrony with the beat, that this difference is bigger in music than with a metronome. And our explanation of this is that music is a stimulus that comes with a lot of social expectations. So another person that is not behaving as I expected is way more annoying, and another person that behaves as I'm expecting it I might like that person more than. And the metronome is a more abstract stimulus that is less connected to social expectations. So that is our explanation for these effects. Let's jump right to the second study, in which we were asking, how do cultural background and personal musical taste affect social bonding? We had a similar design. It was a bit easier. The two figures were either walking in synchrony with each other, or in the second synchrony condition, the own figure was walking in synchrony with the beat, and the other figure was walking asynchronously. And we had a few different auditory stimuli. I want to focus on one study where we used like the broad region of West African music, South Asian music, and Latin American music. And we tried to have a very cross-cultural sample. So we just shared the questionnaire online, and we tried to reach a lot of participants from different continents. But of course, as always, we ended up with a quite weird, heavy sample. We had 114 participants from Europe, 41 from Asia, 21 from North America, 14 from Latin America, 8 from Africa, and 6 from Oceania. So everything is in there, but it's quite heavy on Europe and Americas, of course. For the music selection, we started with 4 different music stimuli for each of the regions that we defined. And we asked in a pre-study how familiar, how enjoyable the stimuli are, and in what mood the stimuli puts to participants. And we also asked them to guess where the stimuli might come from, just to have a good selection of stimuli. And then once we narrowed it down to 3 different ones, we made sure that the stimuli are comparable in sensory motor synchronization, like how easy it is to synchronize to them, and also in terms of how easy it is to tell if a stick figure walks in time with the beat or not in time with the beat. So we made it quite comparable. And I can just play you 2 examples. So in this case, we have synchronous movements, and it was cumbia, so representing the broad region of Latin America. And another example. So in this case, it was asynchronous movements and representing music from the broad region, South Asia. For the dependent variable, we used the inclusion of other in the self scale, which basically gives you a measure of social closeness between one self and another person. For the results, we also asked participants how familiar they were with the music and how much they enjoyed the music. So in the left figure, you can see that there was a main effect of movement, meaning that with synchronous movements, the inclusion of other in the self was rated higher than with asynchronous movement. And there was also a main effect of familiarity of the music, meaning with more familiar music, inclusion of other in the self was higher than with less familiar music. Interestingly, for enjoyment of the music, we also saw the main effect of synchronous versus asynchronous movement, but we saw an interaction with enjoyment of the music, meaning that with more enjoyed music, the difference between inclusion of other in self with synchronously walking other virtual other and asynchronously walking virtual other was bigger than the difference with music that was less enjoyed. So it might be driven by a more positive effect of walking together with a person that is moving synchronously, but we're not quite sure about that yet. Yeah. So let's jump to the last study. Sorry, my PowerPoint is just taking a timeout right now and is not responding. Let me try to fix that. Okay, seems that we are back. Yes, I'm very sorry. This is where we should be. So for the last few minutes, I want to talk about the third study that we did, in which we asked how does trait empathy affect social bonding in interpersonal movement interactions. So now it's all about empathy. We again used the video paradigm, and we again had 3 different movement conditions, either both aligned with the beat, self in time with the beat, other not in time, self not in time with the beat, and other in time with the beat. And we used an instrumental piece by the great Esbjørn Svensson trio and a metronome as musical stimuli. And then we were asking, after the experiment, we were asking participants to fill out the brief interpersonal reactivity index, which is just a short form of the interpersonal reactivity index that is often used for a measure of trait empathy. It's 16 items, so it was just quicker for us to do it like that. And then let's jump to the results again. What we saw was super interesting, namely that with a metronome, participants with higher empathy had lower ratings of inclusion of other in the self. But with music, participants with higher empathy had higher ratings of inclusion of other in the self. And this interaction was also showing up in our comparison of mixed effects models. So the best fitting model was actually one that included a main effect of movement synchrony, but an interaction of metronome versus music and empathy. And this also becomes clear when you look at this other figure, where you can clearly see that with participants with higher empathy preferred or rated the inclusion of other in the self higher with music than with a metronome. But for participants with lower empathy, it was the other way around. They rated inclusion of other in the self higher with a metronome compared to music. Then, because we thought, okay, it might be just an effect of having just one musical stimulus, we did a similar experiment again, where we had just 2 movement conditions, both figures aligned with the beat, or the own figure aligned with the beat and the other figure not aligned with the beat. And we had 3 different metronomes. Here it was an eighth and here a quarter note. And then we had also a 6/8 metronome, just to mix it up, because also the song by EST was in 6/8. And we had 3 different songs. The song that we had in the previous experiment by the Esbjørn Svensson trio, plus My Father's Eyes, pop rock song by Eric Clapton, And again, we used thinking by the meters. And all of them were acoustic or like instrumental parts of the song without any vocals. And if you look at the results here, we saw a different picture. We didn't see the empathy and music interaction anymore, but we saw an interaction between movement synchrony and empathy, meaning that individuals with less trait empathy might actually differentiate less between temporally aligned and temporally misaligned other persons compared to participants with high trait empathy, as you can see here. So it seems to be more important if another person moves in time with the beat or not in time with the beat for individuals with more trait empathy. So to sum up the results of the 3 experiments, first question was, how does music affect social bonding in interpersonal movement interactions? And we found that music can increase social bonding, and especially when one interacts with a person who moves in time with the beat. Second question was, how do cultural background and personal music taste affect social bonding in interpersonal movement interactions? And our findings suggest that individual musical preferences might be more relevant than the musical familiarity, and that with music that we enjoy, interpersonal synchrony is probably more relevant than with music that we do not enjoy. And for the last question, how does trait empathy affect social bonding in interpersonal movement interactions? And there our results suggest that the role of empathy is quite complex, but it seems to affect what type of music a person prefers in social interactions. And it seems to affect how much a person cares about if another person moves synchronously versus asynchronously with oneself or the music. So with that, I want to thank everyone who contributed to all of the research. That is Peter Wust, Peter-Jan Mess, Maria Wittek, Jana Wuskowski, Matthias Witte, Guillaume Wood, and Janni Mikkelsen. If you want to read more about all of this, you can find it on this homepage where there's a list of the publications. And of course, you can follow me on Twitter if you like. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jan. A neat progression of studies, very clearly presented. Do we have any questions from the audience? Please type them in the YouTube chat, and I'll transfer them to Jan in Zoom if you do. There is a question actually, and it's from Merle, I imagine. Just a moment. Yeah, so the question is, do you have something to say about potential mechanisms specifically related to the empathy results?
I think it's super fun to speculate, but it's also a bit risky to speculate. I'm not quite sure. I think we need more research on people that on people with ASD maybe to really see if there is this preference for maybe less complex stimuli, less musical stimuli in social interactions in these people. Yeah, or one could again think that the social expectations that come with music, again, might be just stronger in people with higher empathy. So that might also be a reason for it. But yeah, I think it's just speculations, and I'm looking forward to actually work on this more.
Okay, and in the meantime, we have a second question from Duani. This is a directionality type question. Here it is. Do you think that the synchronous asynchronous movement of the figures might work the other way around by affecting participants' preference of novel musical excerpts?
Let me just read the question again. I'm not quite sure how this synchrony should affect the novelty of the musical excerpts.
Preference for the novel excerpts. So if you were to play them other music, if they were watching or interacting with somebody synchronously, would that affect their enjoyment or preference for the music, I guess is the spirit of the question. Not just the music affecting relationship with music,
okay.
Feelings for the
that's
other
actually
person,
interesting.
Feelings for the music.
Yeah. This would be interesting. I mean, it could be done in kind of a pre-post design where you would ask participants to rate music before and after a social interaction. So I guess the idea would be that seeing a person interacting in a synchronous way with a stimulus would make you like that stimulus more, right? That's interesting. I don't have any data on it, but yeah, I guess a pre-post social interaction design could answer that question. I don't know if everybody has done that.
Could reveal something about the types of mechanisms involved, if they are bidirectional, unidirectional, but also from other domains, it would be interesting at the synchrony level, but certainly we I think work on effects of peer group. If you identify with people you tend to like, you can develop preferences for things that they like, and it's the way the peer group influence works. So at that level, the level of synchrony is an interesting aspect that can get to mechanism as well. Are there anything else that somebody would like to ask Jan? There's a lot of applause here, by the way, and congratulatory icons. I have a question, if I may, then, Jan, about musical experience. Did you examine that in any of the studies, and did that play a role? Not just familiarity for the music, but ability to produce music at a high level.
Yeah, we did actually in the first study where we tested music in a metronome, which was also the study with the smallest sample. We had 100 participants there, and we couldn't see any effect of musical expertise. Also there, I had a bachelor student who was working on this several years ago, and she was also looking into musical expertise. She was comparing people playing in marching bands and non-musicians. So where there's like this really, it is really ecological valid, I would say, to use people in a marching band because they're used to synchronizing while walking. So yeah, I guess if you could see an effect, then you would have seen it there. But actually, we also didn't see an effect there. So it might be more universal than we think. Might be not that much affected by musical expertise.
So actually, that's potentially informative about the generality of the mechanism and the level at which it's operating, perhaps. Okay, so I think we're out of time. Thank you again, Jan, for the presentation and people for questions.